Hi, this is Eric Keller for Otoy. In this video, we're going to talk about rendering displacements using the Octane plugin for Maya. We're going to talk about how I rendered displacements to create the cracks in the surfaces of this crystal version of the Octane logo. So let's start by taking a look at the scene as it's set up in Maya. It's a very simple scene, only a few pieces of geometry. I have a ground plane, sort of bed of rocky geometry right here, some smaller crystals, and the logo itself. So we're just going to focus mainly on the logo. The logo geometry does have its own UVs, so if I go into the modeling menu set and choose UVs, UV editor, you'll see that it's got, kind of very simple UVs. The model itself was sculpted in ZBrush. Let's take a look at the logo here. I'm going to turn on the solo button. And you can see I've sculpted scratches and cracks and other details and made the surface somewhat uneven so that it would reflect light in kind of an interesting crystal-like way. If we take a look at the geometry, it has several levels of subdivision. So the lowest subdivision level is only 7,200 points. But this actually has 6 levels of subdivision, and at the highest level it's 7 million points, so it's got a lot of detail in there. So instead of using the 7 million point version of the model in the Maya scene, I'm rendering the 7,200 point version of the model. So of course, to get all this high resolution detail, I'm using a displacement map. So as long as the model has UVs, creating a displacement map in ZBrush is very easy. I use the multi-map exporter plugin, which is found in the Z plugins palette. So I'm going to put this over here in the toolbar. And if we take a look in the multi-map exporter plugin settings, I've got displacement map set up as my output. I'm not worried about these other maps for this particular scene. I've set the map size to 4K, so that's 4096 by 4096. Turn on flip V, turn on re-smooth UVs at the highest subdivision level. And then down here, under the export options, so if I expand export options under displacement, I'm going to be displacing from the first subdivision level and comparing it with the 6th subdivision level. So this is set to 1. I've turned on adaptive, smooth UV, and I'm going to turn on 3 channels, 32-bit EXR. So this is a 32-bit EXR displacement map, meaning that it's a floating point displacement map, which has a large amount of data, which ensures for more accurate displacement. The most important setting that I need to pay attention to is this one right here, this 0.5 mid value. So this is basically saying that when it creates the displacement map, 50% gray or 0.5 gray is going to be no displacement. Anything higher than 0.5 is going to push the geometry outward when it's rendering, and anything lower than 0.5 is going to push the geometry inwards. We'll see how this becomes significant when we get back into Octane for Maya. But once again, this is set to 0.5. With all my settings created, I can just press the Create All Maps button, choose a location on my hard drive, give it a name, and then when I choose Save, it will actually create the displacement map. This one took about 5 or 6 minutes to create on this particular machine. So back in Maya, I want to go over quickly how I set up the lighting in the scene. I have an Octane Sun and Sky Transform node. This is created by going to the Octane Render shelf and clicking on this button right here. I'm going to switch to the perspective view. You can see that it is represented by this sphere right here at the origin. I have this set to texture environment, and I've set the texture to 0, meaning black, so it's creating a dark scene. My other lighting setup is extremely simple. I have an area style Octane light up here pointing down from the top, and that's set pretty bright. And then I have a sphere kind of in the background providing some backlighting and tucked away down here. So that's kind of creating some of these highlights down here in these parts of the surface. So let's take a look at the shader applied to this surface and talk about how to set up the displacement properly. So let's go into the hypershade. Here's the shader that I have applied to the crystal logo. It's actually not terribly complex. It's just a few procedural nodes and the displacement map. In order to best visualize what's going on with the displacement map, let's create a new Octane material. So I'm going to go into the Octane section of hypershade, Octane materials, and let's create an Octane glossy material. and I'm going to middle mouse button drag that on top of my surface here. And let's go in here to the crystal group. I'm going to hide the base and the small crystals. And I'm going to choose render snapshot camera 1 and hit IPR. So this is now what we have. So this is the surface without any displacement on it. So you can just see kind of the low resolution kind of details carved into the surface. But obviously it doesn't look much like a crystal. Let's take a look at a couple things. I'm going to go into the render settings. Obviously make sure Octane Render is set as the rendering. I have my CUDA devices enabled, so I just have one GeForce GTX 1080 Ti in this machine. I'm actually, in order to speed things up, I have this set to PMC, which renders all that nice kind of crystal refraction and caustic light patterns and so on. But while I'm testing out the displacement, I'm going to speed up the process by switching to direct light. And I'm going to make sure that the GI mode under direct light settings is set to diffuse, just to get a nice higher quality render. And let's select the geometry and go into the channel box. I'm going to set the geometry type to global so that it just loads once whenever it's rendering the scene. That'll save a little bit of time. And I'm also going to go down to the open subdivision level here. Let's set this to 1 so that we subdivide the surface one time, which will give us more geometry. It'll smooth it out a little bit, but it'll also give us more geometry to use when we're actually displacing the surface. Let's go back to that glossy shader that we've applied. And just so that it's a bit easier to see the displacement, I'm going to lower the diffuse, increase the specular, and increase the roughness. Just so it's obvious, you can see how the light's reflecting off the surface. Now, to actually hook up the displacement, I'm going to go to the displacement slot here in the shader, click on the checker box, which opens up the Create Render Node window. It should automatically open up to Octane Displacement. I will now click on the Octane Displacement node, which connects the displacement node to the shader. The displacement node allows us to create all our settings for the displacement, but now we have to hook up a texture. So I'm in the tab for the Octane Displacement node, and I'm going to click on the checker box. Again, this brings up the Create Render Node window, and I'm going to choose an Octane image texture. Keep in mind you need to use Octane nodes when creating Octane shading networks for it to render properly. So I'm going to go to the folder icon, which opens up the browser to the source images of the current directory. So I'm going to select my Octane logo DM 32-bit EXR. This is the displacement map that I created in ZBrush, and I'll choose Open. And you don't see much of a change yet, a little bit, but what we need to do now is we need to go back to that displacement node. If I graph this shader, by the way, let's graph it so we can see what's going on. I'm going to select it down here, click on Input and Output Connections, so we can see that here is our material, here is the displacement node, and here is our texture, which is doing the displacing. So, and this is hooked up from out text to texture, and then from out displacement to displacement. So let's go into the displacement node, and I want to set the level of detail to match the resolution of my displacement map. So I'll set this to 4096 by 4096. Since I created a 32-bit EXR, I should be able to just set the height to a value of 1 and it will displace correctly. However, you can see it's looking a little bit puffy and strange, not terribly crystalline. And that is because I currently had the mid-level set to 0. So I need to set mid-level to 0.5. And now it's starting to look a lot better. And this 0.5 setting here matches the 0.5 setting that I created in ZBrush under the Multimap Exporter plugin settings. So if you're using Mudbox or another sculpting program to create the displacement maps, just make sure that its mid value is set to 0.5 wherever you find that particular setting. So now that it matches, we have a nice displacing surface. And I shouldn't have to do too much more to it to have it displaced correctly. So I'm going to reapply my original shader to the surface. So I'll go into the Hypershade. Here's my logo shader, so I'll middle mouse button drag it on top of this. Let's move the Hypershade out of the way. Hit IPR again. This is our crystal shader. Keep in mind I am still rendering with direct lighting. It looks pretty good for direct lighting anyways, but you can see how that displacement, those details, are creating this nice sort of interior bouncing effect. So we can see the refracted cracks in the surface. It really makes it look nice and realistic. Let's take a quick look finally at the shader settings that I have. So I'm going to select my shader, graphics, input and output connections, and then zoom in. So the type of material I'm using, or the shader that I'm using, is an Octane specular material. And for the bump, I have a subtle noise texture effect, and I'm using a box projection and a 3D transform. So I've used the 3D transform to scale it up by a factor of 15, and then I've just kind of played with the bump settings just to create a very kind of subtle bump on the surface. And I found the circular noise type worked best for this particular effect. And then I have the displacement node, which I already demonstrated how to set that up. It's the same idea. To get the, let's untangle these a little bit. And then in the roughness, I have an Octane dirt texture, which is essentially an ambient occlusion shader, and it is plugged into the amount of a mix texture. And then I have two textures going into the mix texture. So I have one which is set to a value of 0, so these are float textures, and the other is set to a value of 0.01. So it's creating a very dark kind of ambient occlusion effect that's being which is now being plugged into the roughness. So this helps to kind of break up the roughness a little bit, especially around the cracks, and make it a little bit more interesting looking. And if I take a look at the actual dirt texture node, I have the strength set to about 9. I just messed with the setting until it looked good. I set the details pretty high, the renderings to about, the radius to about 10. And if you take a look, you can see how it's very, very subtle, but it does tend to break up or add a little bit of roughness, which helps to create kind of a slightly blurred refraction within the surface to make it look like it's solid and not like it's pure glass. And then I have simply a red color plugged into the transmission setting of the specular material. So this is an RGB spectrum node set to kind of a pinkish red, and that is plugged into transmission, which is giving us this nice kind of red color, this kind of ruby-like transmission on the surface. And then I duplicated this shader, removed the displacement map, and applied it to the other, the small crystals in the scene. And then for the large crystal, I just have a very simple, dark, glossy shader. And that's essentially how the shaders were set up. So hopefully this will give you a good idea of how you can use displacement within your Octane render scenes. And I hope this tutorial was helpful for you.